Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on avian influenza. Nearly 500 people have registered for this event, which shows how important a topic this is to everybody who takes care of poultry and game birds. My name is Máire Burnett, and I'm chair of the UK Poultry Health and Welfare Group, an industry government forum bringing together each part of the poultry sector engaged in breeding and rearing poultry, including game birds, to drive improvements in animal health and welfare. The aim of this webinar is to raise awareness of the threat of avian influenza this winter and how we can all work together to mitigate the risk of disease entering this country. Before we start, I'd like to run through some housekeeping. All participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but you have the facility to ask questions using the Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. So as you know, the webinar is being recorded, and you will have another chance to view the speakers and the presentations after the event. We would also welcome your feedback on this evening's session, so please respond to the feedback survey, which will be sent out after the webinar. And my huge thanks to George Tice and the expert team at Elanco Animal Health for their fantastic support in facilitating the webinar this evening. I will now hand you over to your moderator for this evening, Mark Williams. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Máire, and hello, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to extend my welcome to you all also, and we do really appreciate you taking the time to come and join us this evening. What we have for you this evening are 5 speakers with a huge range of both knowledge as well as of experience with dealing with bird flu cases as and when they arise. So what we would very much like to be able to do this evening is to get across the very important points, which is about biosecurity and other disease control measures. And of course, you know, what we want to do, or you to be able to do, is go away from this webinar this evening, hopefully having received the answers to the questions or any clarifications on any points you may need. So without further ado, I'll move on and to introduce our first speaker this evening. And this is Christine Middlemiss. Christine is the UK's Chief Veterinary Officer. She was appointed UK CVO on the 1st of March 2018, having worked as the Chief Veterinary Officer in New South Wales in Australia, where she led major improvements to biosecurity across many farming sectors. Prior to moving to Australia, Christine led Defra's Animal Traceability and Public Health Policy team, and also previously the surveillance, including detection and responses to new and emerging diseases such as Schmallenberg and porcine epidemic diarrhea. Before joining the UK government services in 2008, Christine worked in private practice with specific interest in research, meat processing and livestock genetics for a number of years in Scotland and the north of England, and joined the Animal Health Agency, which is now part of Animal and Plant Health Agency, or APHA, as a divisional veterinary manager in Scotland. Christine does come from a farming background with a background in beef, cattle and sheep. So please, I'd like to introduce Christine Middlemiss.
I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's seminar. I think it's going to be really valuable to us all. As the UK Chief Veterinary Officer and jointly with my devolved Chief Veterinary Officer colleagues, our main priority is to protect our animals, all of your animals, from devastating diseases that impact on their welfare, our own health, and our ability as the UK to trade. I'm going to be providing an update on the global disease situation, the risk of incursion to the UK, and to raise general disease awareness. Currently, the UK is free from avian influenza, and this has been since we self-declared freedom following the bird flu outbreak last December 2019 of low pathogenic avian influenza. But there is disease circulating not so far away. There are outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza strain H5N8 in domestic poultry in both Russia and Kazakhstan. These have been ongoing between July and October. This virus strain has been reported not just in domestic poultry, but also wild birds, including mute swans in both countries. The majority of the outbreaks in Russia are occurring in small backyard flocks, likely due to the introduction of virus by migratory wild birds and wild fowls particularly. And poor biosecurity results in local spread between farms. There's also been one large commercial farm, extremely large commercial farm involved. The flight pathways of wild birds coming to the UK link back to those of Europe and link back to those potentially that may have started the outbreak and brought disease to Russia and Kazakhstan. So these are all reasons that we need to be really, really aware of what's going on and thinking about our biosecurity in the UK. Last week, additionally, there was a case of H5N1 reported in Israel, and there's been new outbreaks from September to October of H5N6 in the Philippines and also in Vietnam. They've had both H5N6 and H5N1. I'm giving all this information to make you aware bird flu is constantly out there somewhere in the world, and migratory wild birds are a great way of spreading it further. So just because it's far away doesn't mean to say we're not at risk. Our current risk is from incursion from wild birds in the UK is low, but it is ever present. This is due to the constant presence of low pathogenic strains of bird flu in wild birds, particularly waterfowl. Individual poultry premises in the UK, the risk of introduction remains low for poultry premises which have strong biosecurity measures. But as winter approaches and the wild bird migration season is beginning, as the weather becomes increasingly colder, the risk of disease incursion increases as the migratory wild waterfowl return to the UK. We are not complacent. We monitor the global situation every day and specifically monitor countries in the same migration flyway, so Poland, Germany, Denmark, Finland. And if cases are reported there, then our own risk of incursion may well start to increase. So last week we issued a press notice to raise awareness of this avian influenza ahead of the winter season. It is really important that all poultry keepers, whether you have pet birds, backyard flocks, and commercial poultry keepers, act now to reduce the risk of wild bird flu to your flock. So what is it you can do to reduce the risk? It's vital that you maintain the highest level of biosecurity at all times. There's three key things that you need to prevent. One, access of wild birds to areas and equipment where your birds are and directly to your own birds. You must try to prevent that wild bird access. You need to keep everything in contact with your birds clean, so water bowls, feeding areas and so on, and also free from rodent access. Rodents can be a great fomite, a vehicle for virus coming in between wild birds, not so far away, and your own birds. And you need to manage everything and everyone that comes onto your farm, because again, they can be vectors of this virus. I ask that all poultry keepers register their birds on the GB Poultry Register in Great Britain, or if you're in Northern Ireland, with the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Register. By registering your birds, it means that government can contact you during disease outbreaks and provide you with up-to-date advice to limit the chances of your birds getting disease. If you have over 50 birds, then it is a legal requirement that you register your flock in GB, but I strongly urge all bird keepers, however many you have, to register and get those updated text alerts from us when something is happening. You should remain vigilant for any signs of disease in your flock. Regularly check your birds for any signs of illness and seek prompt advice from your vet if you're concerned about the health of your birds. It's essential that you report any suspicion of bird flu, either to APHA in Great Britain or to the department in Northern Ireland. Swift reporting is absolutely crucial for successful control of bird flu. You can find further information by searching for avian influenza on gov.uk. It will provide you with both advice on biosecurity and for registering your poultry. And you can also check out what our interactive map means, highlighting higher risk areas for bird flu. These are something that we may well bring in should the disease risk from a continent increase, where we're looking at putting in areas of higher risk with potentially further measures. Thank you for listening, and do look for further advice if you need it. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Christine, for that very useful update. So we've got time for a couple of questions before we move on to the next speaker. So we've had a question in from Carol Kyle. How feasible do you think it is for small-scale poultry keepers to follow biosecurity guidance, given that many are free range? So can you take that, Christine, please?
Oh, yes, hello, sorry. You think I would learn to be not on mute by now. How feasible it is? I think it is pretty feasible, actually. Certainly the cleanliness of, equipment and things, and making sure that vermin and so on don't have contact. I would really hope that people are thinking about sighting their birds not near open water where wild birds congregate. It's perfectly possible in a number, not all, but a number of circumstances to net over the top of your birds. Of course, that depends how many you have and so on. The most important bit is that you take the biosecurity measures that are relevant to how you manage your birds and what risks they might be at. We do publish, as I think I said in the presentation, high risk areas for England, so people can understand what risk, where they are in relation to water areas where we know that wild birds congregate. So absolutely people should be checking that out in relation to where their birds are. And finally, again, I know I said this a lot in the presentation, but I will repeat it again. Do register, even if you've got less than 50 birds, because that means that we can give you enhanced biosecurity advice during periods of higher risk. Thank you.
Okay, Christine, very quickly, I have another one from Kat Broadhead. How would you know if your birds have the influenza? Are there common symptoms? But I guess, Christine, that might be covered. Well, I know it will be covered by Daniel. So Kat, if you can bear with us on that, we should be able to address that. I have one very quick one for you, Christine, and that is that on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you say we are compared to the H5N8 cases we saw in 2016-17? So in other words, this threat coming out of Russia and from the east. Do you see it as a greater threat than 2016-17 or on a similar level?
Not greater at the moment, potentially similar. We're keeping a close eye on it to see what it develops. Of course, in 2016-17, we knew about the flight path, but we hadn't had that, previous time experience of looking at them to be a really good sort of almost sentinel, if you like. So yeah, I don't think at the moment it's greater, but we're watching closely. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, ladies and gents, we'll move on to our second speaker. This is Lee Grant, who is chairman of the Poultry Club of Great Britain and a breeder and exhibitor of bantams for over 35 years and trustee of the Poultry Club for at least 4, where his involvement has including leading liaisons with government departments relating to avian diseases and, very importantly, promoting good biosecurity throughout the non-commercial poultry fancy. Lee's worked in the voluntary sector for almost 2 decades, and his current role as a senior legacy manager at Cancer Research UK seeks to influence a step change in the number of wills that leave a gift to charity, safeguarding the future of worthy causes such as the preservation of pure and traditional breeds of poultry. Lee, over to you, please.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session from me, Lee Grant, the chairman of the Poultry Club of Great Britain. For those of you that don't know, the Poultry Club is a registered charity in the UK that exists to safeguard the interests of pure and traditional breeds of poultry, which includes chickens, turkeys, geese, ducks, and their eggs. We're a membership organisation and have around 1,250 members at the moment and around 250 affiliated societies, which are breed clubs and agricultural societies that would run poultry shows and exhibitions. We have a range of breeders of poultry and exhibitors of poultry within our membership, from those who would consider themselves to be professional breeders, breeding several hundred, down to those who have a small number of poultry in their back garden, perhaps chickens for a few eggs, and so on. So the membership is quite diverse, from those that are breeding and exhibiting at the highest level to those who are perhaps after just a few eggs for their breakfast. So what I want to talk to you about in this short session is avian influenza from a non-commercial perspective, and I want to talk to you about 5 main things: the value of pure breeds of poultry, which is what the Poultry Club stands for, good biosecurity, poultry sourcing and movements, the identification of avian influenza, and then safeguarding the poultry and the food industry by those things that I have mentioned. So as we know, we're moving into the winter season now. This is traditionally the season when there becomes a higher risk of avian influenza from migrating birds, but it's also the season in the poultry calendar for the Poultry Club where there are lots and lots of poultry gatherings in the form of exhibitions. However, in 2020, that is not the case. And what we usually do at this time is to notify our members, those organising shows and exhibitions, we remind them about biosecurity, about avian influenza and so on. This year, however, because there is not as much activity, we're not seeing that opportunity as much. So I welcome the opportunity tonight to share a little bit of information from ourselves. So as I say, it's the high risk period that we're approaching, and we need to be vigilant, because in particular the Poultry Club of Great Britain's members, by definition, our members' birds are potentially rare, they're potentially valuable, and some of which are irreplaceable. There are some breeds and strains of poultry that simply cannot be replaced, so they're extremely valuable, and we do want to make sure that we preserve those breeds and we minimize any risk of disease. So in terms of the biosecurity, the Poultry Club does have a responsibility for promoting good welfare, but also good biosecurity. And obviously this can have an impact on the wider poultry and food industry when it goes wrong. So what we suggest, and we take advice from APHA and Defra in the UK, and this is the type of information that we share and I want to share with you this evening. So to minimise the movement of birds between enclosures and sites, to ensure that clean equipment is worn between sites, and we can't stress enough how important it is to deter wild birds that can potentially spread avian influenza and other diseases. So by way of fencing, feeding under cover, not wasting food and leaving surplus food lying around. So anything that you can do to deter wild birds is really, really important. Again, in terms of cleanliness, vermin control is really, really important, and cleanliness. So the use of foot dips and good hygiene, particularly when moving from building to building and site to site, is really, really important. In terms of spotting avian influenza, those members of the Poultry Club and those of you watching that have poultry will know that a lot of diseases and ill poultry will show symptoms in the sort of the head and the nasal area, and it's no different for avian influenza. In particular, looking for things like swollen head, blue and discoloration of the neck and throat, and respiratory distress, so things like gaping and sneezing and general snuffling of the poultry should be observed. There will be a loss of appetite and diarrhea. Obviously, there will be few eggs laid at that time when the bird is unwell, and with particularly the highly pathogenic avian influenza, increased mortality and quite often sudden death. And I know that poultry keepers will observe that, but I think pay most attention to those things at the top of that list when doing your usual checks, which should be done at least daily, ideally more regularly. And as the note at the bottom there suggests, clinical signs can vary between species of bird, and some species, in particular waterfowl, don't actually show as many symptoms as chickens, for example. Just to summarise, in terms of the responsibilities that we all have, I think good record keeping, good husbandry, good biosecurity, making sure that your birds, your poultry are checked regularly is really, really important. It's not just your own birds that you are safeguarding, it's that of the poultry industry, and of course the food industry as well. So in conclusion, protect your own birds, maintain good biosecurity, discourage wild birds. A good tip is not to mix waterfowl and other types of poultry. Be vigilant in where you're sourcing your poultry from and minimize the number of trips that you do when sourcing poultry. Be sure that you're confident if you're purchasing poultry as any livestock that it's from a reputable breeder and the parent stock are of good health. And as I say, minimize movements, good hygiene systems on site, and minimize cross-contamination, be that between sites, be that between buildings, and general good biosecurity, for example, feeding the youngest stock first, potentially the most vulnerable, through to the older stock last. And I can't stress enough about knowing your diseases, particularly the symptoms of avian influenza. Know where to find that information out. Obviously, when we are running poultry gatherings, that information is displayed and is shared with all the participants. And just finally, thank you for listening in. For those of you that want more information about the Poultry Club, about the advice that we can give, which is available for free on our website, please visit poultryclub.org. Thank you. Good evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that very useful update. I have one for you, Lee, I think. Other speakers could probably equally well answer it, but I'll pose it to you first. What risk do pigeon races pose to free-range flocks when the birds are released on farm tracks and roads in rural areas? Are you okay to answer that, Lee, please?
Mark, I'm not sure that Lee's on the call. So
okay. Well, okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, what we'll do then, ladies and gents, is we'll move on to our next speaker. So the theme of the next speaker, which has already been some of the questions which I think Daniel will answer, have already been raised. But Daniel's theme is good and bad biosecurity, spotting clinical signs of disease, and then we'll follow that with one or two questions. So a brief introduction on Daniel Parker, for those of you who may not know him. Daniel qualified from Cambridge University Veterinary School in 1983, and for a period worked in mixed practice. He became involved in the poultry industry in 1992, whilst working for Internet Technical Services, and in 1996 established Slate Hall Veterinary Practice. And this provides diagnostic services to a wide range of clients, and that includes right across the UK poultry industry. In addition to his clinical work, Daniel is the veterinary advisor to the British Poultry Council. That's the trade body for the poultry meat sector in the UK. He's a board member of the Animal Health and Welfare Board of England, an external consultant to the FAO, and visiting lecturer at Cambridge University Vet School. And he's also authored a number of scientific publications and been a guest speaker at numerous veterinary conferences. Daniel, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. In my presentation, I'm going to be discussing briefly the clinical signs that we see with avian influenza, and also some key aspects regarding biosecurity. So when we consider the clinical signs of highly pathogenic avian influenza, these can actually be quite variable. And it's variable depending upon the type of highly pathogenic avian influenza, but it also is dependent upon the species of poultry that are infected. So for example, waterfowl in the main tend to be more resilient to clinical signs, whereas turkeys are much more susceptible. If you look at the internet, you'll often see pictures of avian influenza, and in those pictures, the general picture you'll see is very, very high mortality, as we can see here in this turkey shed in the top left-hand side, where a vast majority of the turkeys are found suddenly dead. And in the picture down on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, we've got an aviary system, and again, very, very high mortality. Some birds may be seen to be still alive, but are often very, very, very sick. Other signs that we'll see are depressed birds and birds looking hunched, feathers up, as we can see in these turkeys on the right-hand side of the picture. But again, the key clinical sign we see with highly pathogenic avian influenza is high mortality. Cyanosis, which is this reddening that we're seeing on the legs or on the wattles and the comb of birds, and sometimes we'll see swollen heads in birds with avian influenza. These pictures are actually taken from a hobby flock that was affected a couple of years ago, and in this case we can see this bird has got very swollen wattles. It's also got a swollen head, and it was clearly very depressed prior to actually dying. So in summary, the clinical signs of avian influenza can be quite variable, but the key things we tend to see are birds have lost appetite. So there's inappetence, there's increased mortality. You'll see a lot of depressed, sick birds. There may be coughing and sneezing. There may be diarrhea. There may be swollen heads and wattles. And in egg layers, often we'll see depression of egg production. And the egg color, the eggshell color may be affected. So instead of laying a brown egg, for example, there may be a greater preponderance of paler eggshells. Egg production is almost certainly going to drop in egg layers. And occasionally there'll be other signs like nervous signs. So the birds will maybe be seen staggering, or they may be have twisted necks, or showing other nervous signs. So it's rather confusing in some respects. The clinical picture is not necessarily specific for highly pathogenic avian influenza. And I think the key message here is if you have an unexplained mortality or egg production drop, then it's important to consult a specialist poultry veterinarian and or the Animal, Plant and Health Agency. It's far better to report and get advice than harbour disease and potentially spread it to other poultry keepers. I'm now going to talk briefly about biosecurity, because there's no other preventative strategies for avian influenza in this country than biosecurity. But there's a real positive aspect to biosecurity in that if you have good biosecurity, it's a good strategy for preventing a host of other diseases entering your flock. So as a responsible owner, ensuring your biosecurity is robust is really, really important. Now, there are various ways that biosecurity can become breached and disease can enter a flock, but the two key areas that I want to focus on are people and wild birds. So looking at some aspects of best practice as far as biosecurity is concerned, the first thing is to limit the number of visitors to the site. Keep these to a minimum, and it's really important to maintain a visitor's book. And this is an example of a visitor's book where we can see the date, the name of the visitor, the contact number of that visitor, did they enter the bird area or not, the company they work for. And what we ask them to do is to record the previous poultry site they went to and the next poultry site they're likely to go to, their vehicle registration number, and if they come onto the site, whether their wheels have been disinfected, and then recording time in and time out. And this is really important information should at some point your site become an infected premises, because this allows the Animal Plant and Health Agency epidemiologist to actually work back and find out potential dangerous contacts to an infected site. Other aspects of biosecurity, the sorts of biosecurity that we see in the commercial sector is ensuring that people have protective clothing, dedicated protective clothing to the site, foot dips and boot changes, hand washing and hand sanitizers. So this is really a key aspect in terms of preventing infection being carried onto site by visitors. Just showed a picture here of some pole barn turkeys. And again, where we see here, these birds are actually enclosed. They have open sides, but the sides are actually covered with mesh to prevent wild bird access. Looking at free-range turkeys, this is an example of free-range turkeys where the turkeys are allowed outside. One of the things that I would say is not so good about this particular picture is the fact that we've got pooled water on the range. Pooled water is always a risk because there's an opportunity to invite wild waterfowl to come onto site. They love puddles in which they can dabble, and wild waterfowl are a real risk factor as far as the carriage of avian influenza. This is an example of good turkey biosecurity on a free-range site in pole barns. There's a good area of prior to the entrance into the sheds with covering of the ground there with metal plates. And in this particular example, we have a small shed that's been inserted into the door of the polytunnel. And when we look inside that, what we've got in there is we've got dedicated site clothing, and we've also got dedicated boots and a foot dip, so the operators can put that protective clothing on before they enter into the pole barn, into the polytunnel and actually service the turkeys. An example of what I would call good game bird biosecurity on this particular site. You come up to the site, there's a gate, so people don't automatically enter the bird area. We've got boots, dedicated boots outside, which the operators can or visitors can put on. There's a foot dip there, and then there's also hand sanitizers again before they enter the site. And when you go onto the site, the dedicated rearing huts here, we have foot dips before the visitors can actually go into the rearing buildings. If we turn to smallholder best practice, again, the same messages are there, which is minimize visitors, keep a record of visitors onto the site. Ideally, don't mix bird species, especially waterfowl, with other poultry species. And the main reason for that is that if you have waterfowl, there is a chance that they could call in wild waterfowl. Obviously, having calling ducks is a way of attracting in wild birds, and we want to avoid that. We want to avoid that potential mixing of domestic species with wild species. don't provide feed out on the range. So the example on the left-hand side here, we've got a range with a variety of bird species, not ideal because, again, it's a variety of bird species, but there's no outdoor feeding, which is a good thing. If you do feed outside, then perhaps you could have these feeders, covered feeders. So this particular feeder system, the birds actually operate it, they step on the plate, opens it up, and they can have access to feed. And this again minimizes the risk of food being available to attract wild waterfowl onto site. It's important to clear up feed spillages, and this picture on the left-hand side shows some feed spillage I saw on a site. There was it hadn't been cleared up, and this was a key attractant for wild birds. Wild corvids were actually coming in and actually picking up this this food material. And again, there's a risk of bringing that in and bringing it close to your own domestic birds. Avoid open water. A very simple system, nipple system here, put in a hobby farmer flock. Again, avoids pooling of water and avoids attracting wild waterfowl into that area where you have the domestic poultry. So again, avoid open water. And in this particular picture, again, picked up off the internet, shows waterfowl, ducks, alongside chickens with a pond. This is a complete no-no in terms of biosecurity for avian influenza. So in summary, a couple of take-home messages from my presentation. Firstly, if you're in doubt regarding any clinical signs in your birds, seek professional help from a specialist poultry veterinarian or the Animal, Plant and Health Agency. And simple biosecurities will minimize the risk of avian influenza incursion onto site. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So we have, as you'd expect, a number of questions that have come in. We're not going to be able to answer them all now, but two for you, Daniel. The first one is, what do you mean by eggshell colour change? And the second one was, if you spot signs of bird flu in your flock early, what are the chances of the birds recovering?
Okay, so to answer the first question, in terms of egg colour again can be quite variable, but is one of the signs that we see with avian influenza, both low path and also high path. And it's just the impact of the sickness on the bird affects the shell colour. So as I say, a normal brown egg, you're probably likely to see more paler eggs arising. Now, that's not pathognomonic for avian influenza. It can be caused by a number of other diseases as well, but it is often a sign that we see. In terms of recovery, I think with highly pathogenic avian influenza, it's highly unlikely that they're going to recover if they become infected. But more importantly, if we identify it, then what is the action that's going to be taken is a stamping out procedure. So the flock will be depopulated. And that's in the best interest of all poultry keepers, because what we mustn't do is we mustn't allow avian influenza to become established in the country, and then the risk of onward spread through other factors rather than direct incursions from wild waterfowl.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Okay, we'll move on to our fourth speaker now, ladies and gentlemen. So this theme is culling and disposal, cleansing and disinfection, regaining country freedom and compensation. So the fourth speaker is Gordon Hickman, who is currently Head of Disease Control within Defra. So Gordon, in this ever-changing world of change, which we're all faced with at the moment, is the one pillar of stability which so many of us have become used to for very many years and greatly appreciate as well. Gordon has an honours degree in agriculture from Reading University. He joined what was then ADAS, the Agricultural Development and Advisory Service, which was an extension of the old Ministry of Agriculture back in 1984, and worked in the southeast of England, specialising in business management and waste and environmental management. Sadly, he was in 2001, he was seconded to MAF to assist with the disposal operations during the 2001 FMD outbreaks, and then joined Defra on a permanent basis in 2004. In between time, he's held various contingency planning roles in the State Veterinary Service, Animal Health, and now APHA. Before transferring to Defra, he was head of Resilience and Central Services in AFAS, where he was responsible for developing the readiness and capability of the agency to deal with outbreaks of notifiable animals. So as I said, Gordon is currently head of exotic disease policy. His responsibilities are wide. He's in charge of policy on exotic notifiable disease of animals, new and emerging animal disease and surveillance policy. So this includes preparedness for outbreaks. He's the animal disease lead for cross-government resilience and capabilities, as well as science evidence for animal health and welfare and surveillance policy. Thank you, Gordon.
Good evening, I'm Gordon Hickman, and I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to speak at this webinar. So I'm going to cover what happens when disease is confirmed, with particular emphasis on the impact on particular infected premises, but I'll also cover regaining country freedom and some of the things around valuation, compensation, culling and disposal, and cleansing and disinfection. So just a reminder, as Christine said, there is a legal requirement for anyone who suspects the presence of a notifiable disease to report it to government. So I'd say to you that if you're worried about the health of your birds, please call your private vet for advice. If, however, you still suspect disease and it can't be ruled out over the phone, an APH vet or a government vet will visit your holding and inspect those birds. And so if they can't rule out disease, they'll initially put you under short-term restrictions and take some swads and blood samples for testing. If the worst comes to the worst and they're positive, then the chief vet will confirm disease and your premises will be declared what we call an infected premises. Now, as soon as disease is confirmed, trading sanctions will be immediately applied to the UK as a whole. That's what we call losing country freedom. And we can only regain that when we've controlled disease, undertaken a whole range of surveillance measures, and undertaken cleansing and disinfection on the affected farms. So what do we do on confirmation? Well, first of all, we put in place restriction zones or disease control zones. And the one on the right is an example from 2017 for highly pathogenic avian influenza. And within those zones, we put in place movement restrictions. We also have a robust, what we call stamping out policy, but that means that birds are culled on the infected premises and all the material there is disposed of in a biosecure manner. And we also undertake surveillance in those zones to check that disease hasn't spread. So just a little bit more about those zones. So here is what we put in place for highly pathogenic avian influenza. So the red triangle in the middle is the infected premises, and we put in place a minimum 3 kilometre prevention zone, or protection zone even, and a 10 kilometre surveillance zone. We also require anyone in those zones to keep records, which must be made available to us. We require birds to be housed, and there are restrictions on anything that might spread disease. So that's poultry, birds, it includes mammals, includes eggs, meat, byproducts, poultry litter, etc. And we also require enhanced biosecurity in those areas. We ban all gatherings, and that would include shows and markets. And we also ban the release of game birds if the time of the year is appropriate. And we might ban shooting. If we were to get low path avian influenza, then very similar controls are put in place, but we restrict that zone to a single zone of 1 kilometre radius. One of the important things as soon as we confirm disease is to find out where it might have come from and where it might have spread to. And so we call that tracing. And so this is where we'll ask you for anyone that's come onto your premises and wherever you've been to in a defined period of time. And that's just a diagram from a recent outbreak, just showing the sort of people that we need to trace. So that's where any dead birds have gone, where any eggs have gone, where people have gone or come from, the pest control man. And that could, you know, on a small premises, just be friends, family that come and walked into the pen, the chicken coop, for example. And that's why we ask you to keep detailed records, you know, between outbreaks as a routine, so that we can easily track down those people and things. So, assuming the worst has come to the worst and we have to cull your birds, we first of all value them. And we normally do that by using what we call rate cards. And if you want to look at them, they're on gov.uk. And there's 30 or so different cards for different situations. And the valuations take account of the species, the age, the sex of the bird, the reason why you're keeping them, whether they're for meat or eggs, etc. And so you just read across the chart, the age of the birds, the production system, and that'll tell you how much you get per bird. We do, however, recognise that some bird types, you may have rare or specialist breeds, don't easily fit those cards. And so in that case, providing it doesn't hold up culling, you can get your own valuer to value those birds, submit them to us, and we'll consider that. We still might appoint our own valuer just to double check those values, but rest assured, you don't have to stick to those values, but it'll be exceptional if they go from them. Also want to just say that compensation is only paid for healthy birds. So let's say you've got 20 birds, half of them are sick, you will only get paid compensation on those 10 birds that are clinically healthy when assessed by one of our vets. So a little bit about culling and disposal. So that's carried out by government under veterinary supervision. The method will depend on the number of birds, the type of birds, for example. So in very small flocks, it'll generally be by lethal injection. But for larger flocks, we'll use containerized gassing units or potentially whole house gassing. I want to stress that it is humane and we follow all welfare at time of killing legislation and take great care over that. We then remove the dead birds, and let's say there's some eggs that are still on the premises. We remove that for biosecure disposal and by incineration or rendering, and government pays for all of that. I'm often asked about rare breeds or can we spare things? Well, exceptionally, if it can be demonstrated that there's no risk of disease spread, then healthy birds that are endangered or are particularly rare may be spared from culling. But there will be a lot of other restrictions in those situations. You'd be expected to keep them in biosecure accommodation, and they would be regularly monitored. Once the birds are culled and removed, we undertake what we call preliminary disinfection, and that's done by government. We spray down with a disinfectant to minimize the immediate threat of disease spread. That's not to say that it kills all virus, because it won't. So the next step after that is for the keeper or the owner of the birds concerned to undertake what we call secondary cleansing and disinfection. So government expects the keeper to do that and to pay for it. So government vets specify what needs to be done, but not how to do it. So that's down to you to work with government to decide how you're going to do that. The sort of things you'll need to do, so manure and bedding needs to be removed and treated or destroyed. And then you must remove all grease, dirt, contamination, etc., from surfaces of buildings, yards, equipment, etc. You'll then need to apply a degreasing agent, wash down with water, then apply a disinfectant, and then leave it to work. And after 7 days, you need to repeat that process again. All through this process, we'll expect you to control rats and mice and to prevent access by wild birds. That's particularly important because we've got known infection on that infected premises, so we don't want it to be spread. Any land or range areas that birds have had access to will also need to be restricted. And we typically do that by leaving it fallow, or occasionally we'll ask you to plough it over or to undertake some other treatments. But you can expect it to be restricted for at least 21 days. So after all that's happened and we've done all the surveillance in those zones that I spoke about, and we've reassured ourselves that there is no disease present, we'll then start to progressively lift those zones. So after 21 days from preliminary disinfection, we'll lift the protection zone, or if it's low path AI, that restricted zone. And then we're left with that 10-kilometre zone, the surveillance zone. Then after a further 9 days, i.e. 30 days after that, we can lift that zone. So that is the restrictions for, if you like, restriction measures, i.e. movement restrictions. Country freedom is also determined by date, but that's from the secondary cleansing disinfection date. So there are 3 possible ways of triggering that clock for OIE country freedom. So the first is full cleansing and disinfection. So that's everything I spoke about before, and you clean up your premises to a place where we would be prepared to allow you to restock under controlled conditions. And at that point, we trigger the clock, and 3 months later, Christine, as UK CVO, can self-declare country freedom. There are 2 other potential triggers for where full cleansing and disinfection isn't undertaken. So the first is where a keeper completes cleansing disinfection to what we call the OIE standard of C&D. So that's a very good clean standard, typically similar to what you would be done between flocks, but it's still not good enough for us to say that you can restock. At that point, a government vet would inspect it, and if they give you the clean bill of health, that also triggers it. We're also conscious that in some cases, a keeper can't afford to, or for practical reasons, they can't do that full cleansing disinfection. And so in that case, a keeper can opt to basically shut down their production for 12 months, to lock up all the sheds, to cease any form of poultry production and any other agricultural production for that matter. And from the date that they sign that declaration, we'll also trigger that. And so 3 months later, we can self-declare freedom. So really just to conclude, it's a shared responsibility between government and the keeper and business. As Christine said, early reporting is the absolute key to effective control. Think about what might happen to you. So just because you're not an infected premises doesn't mean to say you won't be in a zone or you won't be affected by the banning of shows, etc. And just that plug, good biosecurity is the key to keeping disease out. Here's a few sources of information that you can look up at your leisure. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I realise, ladies and gents, that's a lot to take in a short space of time. And it's just as a reminder, remember this event has been recorded and you'll be able to get a hold of it afterwards. Gordon, a couple of very quick questions for you, please. One of them is that if the December 29 outbreak was low pathogenic, why were the birds killed? So, and then the second question was, from Carl Shedden, why have a 50-bird flock as a minimum that are legally required to be registered? Why not all bird flocks? In other words, why is the de minimis in GB set at 50 birds?
Okay, thank you. So I'll take the first one first. So
although the December 2019 case was low pathogenic avian influenza, our control strategy is that we cull low path and high path outbreaks. So low path, we are concerned that that might mutate to a highly pathogenic form. So we want to kill those birds, reduce any virus that might be present. And in fact, in one of the previous outbreaks, back in, I think, 2008, we found some birds, it started off as a low path outbreak, but by the time we came to actually cull them all out, some of those birds had already mutated and it would become highly pathogenic avian influenza. So it's not a voluntary cull for low path. On the question of 50 birds, we have debated whether or not it should be compulsory for everyone to register. Our policy is to choose 50 because that's a figure that above which you can't really claim that it's for self-consumption. So anything above 50 is very much commercial. But we really do encourage everyone to register on the GB poultry register. And if we get to the place where we think that we need to consider reducing that figure to a smaller number, then we'll do that in due course.
Thank you, Gordon, very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on to our final speaker this evening. The theme of this is the impact of bird flu on the commercial sector. Now, clearly, we all know that disease is no respecter of size or even for location for that matter. But what we thought we would do for those of us who work in the commercial sector would be able to give you a short presentation on the effects of bird flu and how it can impact on the commercial sector. So we've asked Colin Adams. Colin is a company veterinarian from Scotland. He's worked with avian chickens for around 10 years. Before that, he worked for the Scottish Agricultural College in veterinary services and animal health. And it's currently now part of AFA. And before he qualified as a vet, he spent some time in the Royal Navy and also worked as a fish farmer, so a wide diversity of experience. Colin's role is the lead for exports out of the UK for Aviagen, and he's also responsible for the veterinary input to the great grandparent flocks and hatcheries. He's currently chairman of the British Poultry Council's Primary Breeders Group, which effectively consists of those companies who are exporting to all parts of the world. And outside of work, it's always good to have the interest. Colin is a keen cycler and swimmer. Over to you, Colin, please.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this webinar. My name is Colin Adams, and I'm going to talk about the impact of avian influenza on the commercial poultry sector. As many of you will know, there's been several outbreaks of high pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, in the UK over recent years. In 2014 to 2015, there was 2 outbreaks, one in breeding ducks and one in free-range indoor commercial egg layers. And in 2016 to 2017, there was multiple outbreaks. There was 13 outbreaks, 6 in small premises with less than 50 birds, 4 in commercial broiler breeders, commercial and breeding turkeys, and 3 in game bird farms. So the whole range of poultry operations in the United Kingdom can and is affected by high HPAI. The industry were surveyed after these outbreaks to try and estimate the cost to the poultry industry, and an estimate of £125 million was the outcome. So a very considerable sum of money that has been lost by the industry due to HPAI. The industry were also asked what was the main disruptor to the sector, and it was actually the disruption to the poultry supply chain. As you've heard earlier, movement restrictions are put on when a case of notifiable avian influenza is confirmed, and this will affect commercial hatcheries, farms, slaughterhouses, egg packing stations, I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. Also in 2016-17, there was a compulsory housing order placed on poultry premises, and it must be a compulsory housing order for free range, still to be marketed as free range, and to carry on with the marketing regulations. So there's a derogation. If there's a compulsory housing order, you can still market your eggs as free range, and that was 12 weeks in 2016-17, and that's now been extended up to 16 weeks. But there's also additional costs for housing your birds when you're not normally used to doing that. Again, as well as the bird welfare, which needs to be taken into consideration, there's also the welfare of the infected premises, so whether or not there's a farm manager or the workers who work there when dealing with an outbreak in an infected premises, and this can be a very stressful time for all involved. So the supply chain interruption, which is the major effect to the industry, can be delay to restocking of day-old chicks on farms, moving eggs to hatcheries, birds to slaughter, early farm depletions, and again, the value of your layer breeders or hens at the end of their life might not be as high as it would have been. So it's not just the risk of getting avian influenza, which is important. It's also, for example, if you've got a hatchery in a restricted zone, there'll be difficulty moving the chicks out of that hatchery, and there'll also be movements of moving eggs into that hatchery. There'll be licensing required, additional costs. Sometimes you'll need to designate premises in order to be able to move in or out of a restricted zone. So there's lots of basically extra bureaucracy and costs involved with restriction zones. As you've also heard earlier, the cleanup costs, the secondary cleanup costs are borne by the poultry keeper, and these in certain circumstances can be high and can really affect that individual business. Business continuity, well, you may have lost some birds, you've certainly probably lost some income, but you may not have been able to provide birds or eggs to your customers. Your customers may have been looking elsewhere for their stock, so there's a loss throughout the chain. Media attention on infected premises can be quite intense, and on multiple occasions you'll have maybe a helicopter flying over the site. You can have reporters at the gate trying to photo or video everything going on. And this is at the same time when you've got other agencies in there. So you'll have APHA, you'll probably have an environmental agency in there. You may have companies looking at how they're going to euthanize the birds. So you've got a lot of media attention, which adds to the stress. And then again, you've also got consumer perception that because there's birds in the United Kingdom with avian influenza, then there's a risk to human health from eating poultry products, which isn't the case. But you may see a drop in egg consumption or meat consumption at that time. It's important to say that the UK is one of the most important countries for export of breeding stock around the world. Together with the United States, they're probably the most two important countries in the world. In 2016, we lost country freedom on the 16th of December. And it wasn't regained again until 17th of September 2017. So you're talking considerable amounts of time, not far off a year, between losing your country freedom and regaining your country freedom. And there's lots of reasons which have been gone into about how difficult it can be to cleanse and disinfect your premises. So what happens in an outbreak? Well, all exports are immediately stopped and all export health certificates are withdrawn. The EU operates a regionalisation procedure, so trade can continue from outside the PZ and the SZ, and this normally happens within hours. You may not even notice that there's been any restrictions because the EU sets this regionalisation up so quickly. What does remain to be seen is when the UK leaves the EU on the 1st of January 2021, how the regionalisation will operate and whether or not they will restrict just a 10K surveillance zone, or whether or not they'll restrict a wider zone, which could impact greatly on the exporting companies, and also how long it may take for this regionalisation to be set up. If it can be done within hours, that would be fantastic. It may take days, which would certainly, again, impact on the sector significantly. Some third countries, these are countries really outside the EU, will accept regionalisation, area freedom, once they have some information from Defra, so basically about the size of the outbreak, the number of birds affected, did it spread, and they will regionalise normally to a particular area relatively quickly, so within possibly days or weeks. However, other countries will not regionalise, and they will wait for country freedom, and Australia, Japan, South Korea, South Africa, Philippines are to name but a few. Some countries say they will regionalise, but when it comes down to the actual outbreak, then the agreement goes out the window, and basically they say, no, we're not going to regionalise, we want country freedom. So it is a complicated situation trying to get these countries to come back online and accept product. Carrying on with the impact on international trade, in 2016, 2017, South Africa put a ban on, and that ban, that avian influenza ban, is still in place, and that was the largest export market for UK poultry meat. So a very significant loss. And again, potentially the largest export market in the world, China put a ban on in the 2014-15 outbreak. And again, that ban remains in place despite positive visit by Chinese officials in 2018 and lots of interventions by government. That ban still remains in place. So it's easy for bans to be put in place, but it can be a lot harder for them to be removed. Disruption to the global poultry production and food security is very important, and the value in exports of both the meat sector and the breeding sector is estimated to be about £665 million a year. And any disruption to that trade, again, would certainly impact on the poultry sector. So just to summarise, the entire poultry industry is affected by notifiable avian influenza, from the very top of the breeding chain to the smallest poultry keeper. And we all need to work together in order to mitigate the risks to all involved. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Colin. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we now have about 20 minutes in which to hold a Q&A session with the speakers. But what I'd like to do is also introduce a few of my colleagues as well. So you've already met Máire Burnett, who's the Technical Director of the British Poultry Council. We also have on the webinar Amy Mahoney, who is the NFU's new Chief Poultry Advisor. We have Charles Nodder, who is the expert of the game farming sector, and myself, and my day role is Chief Executive of the British Egg Industry Council. And of course, we have the speakers to hand, but unfortunately not Lee Grant. So we've had many questions come in. Our colleagues have tried to pull a list together, so very many thanks, Kerry, to try and get some themes. So the first couple of themes that really come to the fore is really communications. And let's be honest, you know, communications in everyday life are very, very important. So I think the first question should probably go to, or questions to Christine and to Daniel, please. And I think one of the ones is one of the questions we had that came through was, well, how can we get to hobby keepers and the non-commercial sector? And that includes people who keep poultry as pets as well. So Christine, if you wouldn't mind taking that, please, first.
Thank you. Yes. So this is something we work closely with our comms team on constantly. We're really aware of how to get messages out to wider than just the commercial sector. We work closely with veterinary colleagues in small animal practice because we recognise that that's often where these keepers will take their birds if they're not well and where they contact first. So although they're not traditional poultry vets, they're one of our key contacts for that. We're constantly looking for new and different ways to connect with these groups of people. So all suggestions welcome. We make as much use of social media and things as we can, but much of it is about talking you know, sharing the message rather than having it on a government website, which isn't necessarily people's first place to stop for that. So it's very much in our minds, and we're always looking for new and different ways to do it. So suggestions are welcome.
Thank you, Christine. Daniel, with COVID having affected so many people since lockdown in March, we've seen a huge increase in the number of people who are keeping 1 or 2 or slightly more or chickens in their back gardens. How do you think we can messaging to people such as that, who, let's be honest, most will not be members of a poultry club or anything like that?
Okay, I think Christine's sort of obviously already communicated about social media, but I mean, an interesting point would be is if everyone who took part in this webinar as a participant actually just spread the word. I mean, the social media is wonderful in terms of, you know, retweeting messages. There's been a number of messages that have gone out prior to this webinar. So again, individuals who are on it, they retweet it and that gets spread through Facebook, through Twitter, Instagram. All of these social media routes are good. And then there's the more traditional route, just people talking. You know, if you see someone who's keeping poultry, you know, have it just to ask them, do they know anything about biosecurity? Everyone has to get food for their birds. So again, you know, routes of messaging which are really important are vendors of food. So farm shops. You go to a farm shop and often they'll sell food, and they maybe sell point of lay hens. These are the sort of the routes that we really just need to get the message out. And they are very simple messages regarding simple measures in terms of biosecurity, and also importantly, you know, early identification and getting our APHA colleagues involved just to check out and make sure that incursions are not happening.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. On a similar sort of comms theme, but bringing a little bit of surveillance into play, this is one for you, Gordon, please. We had a question, which is, what are the best methods for surveillance on smallholder farms who don't register their flocks? So these will be flocks which are below the legal 50 birds in GB, but who are very much poultry keepers, but wouldn't get the messaging come down the text line or emails because they haven't registered on the poultry register.
So I think if we do get an outbreak and we set up those zones, then APHA, working with local authorities, will actually do what we call a foot patrol in that protection zone in the immediate area, and we will identify anyone in that area. Now, clearly that's very labour intensive, and so we'd much prefer to know about everyone first, because that helps us to actually control the disease. But other than that, you know, we will put the messages out. We'll work with all the people that Daniel and Christine have said to raise that awareness. And, you know, it's not too late to register now, and it's not too late to register in the event of an outbreak. So, you know, we'll put out press notices, you know, in terms of, you know, if there is a heightened state of alert, we'll put out a press notice if we confirm disease, and, you know, just keep monitoring those sites. You know, we work really closely with all the speakers here, the British Health and Welfare Trust, you know, all the sorts of people that have those connections with smaller keepers, we'll work with. And, you know, Christine's mentioned small animal vets, who probably are the vets that most small scale keepers go to. So we'll work with them as well.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Gordon. One for you, Colin, please. Whilst you've described very eloquently the process and the effects on live exports, etc., I have a question here. Can you elaborate on the effects on the food industry? So it's more foodie rather than birdie, shall we say?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, I think that the effects on the food industry are very similar to the live poultry industry, particularly with respect to exports. So when they're basically banning poultry or either hatching eggs or chicks, they will also be banning meat exports, and those will also be placed in the same category, and you'll need to basically get that ban lifted just the same. So with respect to exports, they'll be very similar. So the impacts on the meat sector, and it's particularly the meat sector exporting to South Africa, which has been very badly affected, which was in 2016 their biggest export market. And domestically, there will also be consequences. As I said, you might see a decline in meat consumption. There could be restrictions moving products in and out of zones, etc. So overall, the meat sector will be affected, as will the egg sector and the export sector.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. Now, clearly, ladies and gentlemen, you know, prevention is better than cure in life in general, in many ways. But clearly, there will be instances whereby some people, it doesn't matter how big you are, don't obey the rules. And I've had a question here: is there a punishment for those who don't obey the rules? So probably, Gordon, this is one for you.
I think it depends, you know, when we're talking about and the severity of the misbehaving, the non-compliance. So we work really closely with local authorities. There is what we call the National Animal Health and Welfare Panel of local authority experts. And at the beginning of an outbreak, we sit down with them and agree what a proportionate enforcement strategy is. So ultimately, you can be taken to court. Ultimately, you can be fined. But the best thing to do is to work with people rather than to introduce sort of draconian measures like that. So this is about working with people, because a lot of it's ignorance, ignorance of the law, as opposed to willful disobedience. But if a local authority speaks to you, then writes to you, then we will consider taking legal action.
Okay, thank you very much, Gordon. I have another question here from Eric Lovett. Can allotment associations register as a single entity without each individual registering themselves? I'm guessing that's probably going to fall to Christine and Gordon. And sorry, I realise I'm probably sideswiping you on this one, and you may need to take this one away, unless one of you can answer.
I think I'll probably take that away. I think if they are owned separately, then you can't really register separately. But if the allotment society wants to register and share the information amongst the members, we would encourage that, because at least the message is getting out there. We know where the birds are kept. So probably legally, technically, individually, but I would say allotment society, register, we'll communicate with you. If we get to the point where we have to serve restrictions, then we'll reconsider things.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Peter Morgan. Can feed manufacturers be made to put labelling on feed bags saying that all hobbyist or non-commercial flock owners should register their flocks? So that's encouraging manufacturers of the feed to put some messaging on the feed label to help in the communication process. So I don't know if somebody would like to take that. Charles, could we bring you in? I realise you're the game specialist, but it probably is very relevant for your members.
Yes, thank you, Mark. And of course, it's a good idea, and it cuts across all sectors, really. I don't think feed manufacturers can be compelled to put messaging on, but they may well want to, because they want to be seen to be responsible just as much as we in the various poultry sectors want to be. And we've got Elanco, a drug company, sponsoring the webinar this evening and helping us with the technology. And in the same way, feed companies are always keen to promote themselves as being on side with producers and with good practice. So I think it's a good idea, and it's one that we can discuss with the various feed associations and see whether anybody's prepared to take it up. So thank you for that one.
Okay, no problem at all. Okay, just one from me, ladies and gentlemen, really. A comment more than anything else. I mentioned a few minutes ago that prevention is very much better than cure, and we realize that everybody, whether you're in the commercial sector or in the non-commercial hobbyist pet poultry sector, are very, very busy people. But it's always the attention to detail that helps people run their businesses efficiently or look after their poultry efficiently as well. And you know, because we're all very, very busy, it's often the case that when bird flu gets in and then causes an outbreak, it's the little things, you know, it's not the massive biosecurity breaks, because by and large, most people are very good, if not reasonable, at doing what they do. But from my perspective, and I've got the unfortunate badge of dishonour, if that's the right way of putting it, of being involved in every single bird flu case since the Celadike swan back in, I think, 2005. And, you know, we've learned huge knowledge, and indeed we keep on learning things on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, I would just like to say my thanks to both Gordon and Christine and their government colleagues, is that, you know, we do work in partnership, and working in partnership means that certainly we can keep disease out by the messaging and the clear comms, etc. But when disease does strike, you know, we have to work together very, very closely to address those issues and to be able to regain that country freedom, which is, as Colin said earlier, is so devastating to the UK economy, you know, when we do lose that country freedom. So I'm just checking now is if we've got any other questions come in. We have one from Carol Kyle. Is there a way to separate commercial and non-commercial when it comes to AI incursion? Probably one for you, Daniel.
Unfortunately, the legislation doesn't allow that to happen, Mark. And so basically, you know, all poultry are considered to be the same under legislation. And so, if it's identified, then it has to be dealt with in a similar way.
Okay, thank you. I have one from Andy Guy. What are the implications for poultry producers in the event that AI is confirmed in the UK after Brexit? And I guess that's one for Christine and Gordon, please.
So, excuse me, pretty much the same in that the way we approach disease outbreaks will remain the same, with restrictions, stamping out, regionalisation, everything like that. Whilst the free trade agreement and our ultimate relationship with the EU is obviously still under discussion, and our area, known as SPS, is important in that as to how they will finally consider how they would deal with us during disease outbreaks and other things. But for all essential purposes at the moment, it will be business as usual in that space, mostly because the things that we do are based in science and evidence, you know, and have been developed over time to manage that balance between safe trade and not spreading disease.
Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, in the well, I do have one question. I think it's from Rachel. Rachel has rescued caged hens and has expressed some concern at some of the images which she's seen tonight. I mean, I think, just to use the moderator's prerogative here, you know, I think, you know, all commercial poultry farming is governed by legislation, strict legislation on stocking densities and things like that. So it may seem, in fact, some of the pictures that have come across may seem like the birds are very much together, but I can assure you that those photographs would have been taken in sheds where the legal stocking densities have been complied with. Thank you. Okay, as we're sort of drawing towards a close, I would just like to perhaps invite my industry colleagues who haven't spoken yet, just to raise any issues which they, you know, have perhaps been waiting for a question on but haven't had one yet. So Amy Mahoney from the NFU, is there any sort of question or comments you want to make, please?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, there's been some really good questions this evening, and my fellow panelists have answered them very well. The only point I perhaps would just raise and members do raise it from time to time, is about insurance. It's probably is more for the commercial keepers on the call, but just to make sure, obviously we've talked tonight about different costs that are involved with cleaning and disinfection and perhaps business interruption. So just to make sure that they do seek out insurance and adequate cover for their business. But nothing else to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Charles.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry, just unmuting. Yeah, I think the take-home message from me would be, you do not want this disease, whatever scale your operation, whatever bird species you're keeping. This is really bad news, obviously, for your birds first and foremost, for you, for your business, if it's in a business sense, and even if you're not a business, for the wider UK poultry sector. If we lose our country freedom and the restrictions mean that as a nation we can't trade. So it's great that so many people have logged on to learn more about bird flu this evening, and all I'd say is encourage people to continue the research. If you're interested in game birds, there's standing advice on the government website and on the Game Farmers Association website. But it doesn't matter what species you're keeping. Find out more, get that biosecurity in place, and be prepared. Have a contingency plan for if this disease either strikes you, one of your suppliers, one of your customers, or indeed you're just caught up in one of these circular control zones.
Thank you very much, Charles. And I'd just like to invite our speakers, please, if they would like to add any ending comments.
Mark, I would just to reiterate, simple messages, biosecurity, just basic biosecurity, get that in place. And also, if you are at all concerned, please seek advice from APHA. They're there to help us, and they're there to ensure that any incursions are identified quickly.
Very well put. Thank you, Daniel. Gordon, Colin, Christine.
Just to reinforce what Daniel said, simple measures out there. And just a reminder, back in 2016-17, we had 13 of those infected premises. 7 of them were on large commercial farms, but 6 of them were on small scale backyard keepers. So, the risk is out there for any bird keeper. It's not just the commercial ones. It's not just free range. It's not just indoors. It's everyone.
Thank you, Gordon. Very well put. Christine?
My colleagues have made their comment, made the comments very well, and nothing specific to add to them other than support and welcoming the opportunity to be able to have this discussion tonight and share these thoughts with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And Colin?
I think really just what Gordon said, that basically small keepers are affected, the largest commercial poultry farms are affected, everyone can be affected and everyone can improve their biosecurity. Thank you.
What I'd like to do now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll pass now back to Máire Burnett, who is chairman of or chairperson, I should say, of the Poultry Health and Welfare Group, and ask Máire if she'd also like to add a closing comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much for moderating the event tonight. You held us to account, and we're about to finish on time as well. I would like to thank everybody who's joined. We have tried in the past to reach out to all poultry keepers, and I think this is the first event where we've managed to have a good representation from everybody who's got poultry. So I'm hoping when travel restrictions are lifted and things get back to normal, we can actually go out around the country and do our road shows again in the coming year. And we certainly would like to welcome everybody to attend those road shows. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Máire. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as we said earlier, we haven't been able to answer every single question today, but we will certainly try and get back to those who've asked the questions, and the recordings will be made available in due course. I wish you all a very good evening. Please stay safe, and let's keep bird flu out of the UK this winter. Thank you and good night.